As 2025 is coming to a close, let's have a look back at its key updates and announcements. Things that impact your day-to-day work if you develop software for Apple's platforms. What's more important is that these things may have an even greater impact on your work in the near future. I didn't pick features just because I like or wanted to have them. Instead, I'll be trying to analyze the real impact of this year's announcements and changes. And I'll be very interested to learn about your perspective down in the comments. With that said, let's get started. I decided to judge my selection based on two criteria: how big the thing is and how soon it can make an impact on your work. That is why for number 5 on my list, I chose Swift's simplified interop with Java. In my very subjective opinion, Swift is by all accounts a better programming language than Java. It offers more safety at compile time, it runs faster, and it has a smaller resource footprint. All that would make Swift a fantastic tool for typical hot path operations in backend and enterprise apps. I'm talking about things like image processing or data serialization. This is where Swift's native performance gets you a real edge. I tried using this Swift Java package a few months ago. Back then it was still in an early stage. Building a Hello World prototype wasn't very easy, but it was totally doable. It was basically the same story as with every other use case like this: WebAssembly, Linux, Windows, and so on. But on the path to widespread adoption, Swift faces at least 3 colossal challenges. And I'm not sure they can be solved anytime soon, if ever. Because, there are fantastic tools for running Swift on the server. But so far, none of them has made Swift a first-class backend language in terms of actual use. It is still somewhat of a niche language. First of all, the Java ecosystem is enormous. What's more, a project written in Java is not your typical Swift app. Right now, you can't compile Swift older than version 4.2, and it came out in 2018. That means your project's codebase can't be that old. But with Java, it's a whole different story. From what I saw myself, and from what I learned from colleagues, 2014's Java 8 is still extremely widespread, and truly legacy codebases can rely on even older versions. Do you think integrating and debugging Swift would be an easy task? I very much doubt that. But there's more. Even though old versions of Java are still in use, new releases bring much needed improvements to language safety and expressiveness. That means developers who consider adding Swift to the mix will constantly have to compare and deliberate the options. And from my own experience, businesses really don't like this sort of back and forth. And finally, Swift has a public image problem. It is still widely perceived as an Apple language. And this perception is not entirely unfair. Apple has a proven track record of dictating Swift direction for its own agendas. And as you know, Swift's open source nature doesn't always help. Because of that, I wouldn't be surprised if businesses express lots of skepticism, especially those that don't otherwise rely on Apple's tech. But despite all that, I believe that the improved interop between Swift and Java is a really big thing. It may not change your work tomorrow, or ever, if you only develop for Apple devices. But ultimately, it can have a big impact on the state of backend development. That is, unless Swift is once again steered in the wrong direction. Number 4 on my list is the very well needed enhancements to Swift concurrency. Because, honestly, Swift 6 was sort of unusable in existing projects. To fully adopt Swift 6, you had to stop all development and spend perhaps months on refactoring. This year's Swift 6.2 has simplified the concurrency model. It moved the execution to a single actor by default and disabled concurrency unless you opt into it explicitly. That doesn't completely eliminate all those warnings you might have in your project, but it greatly reduces their number. So now a comprehensive refactoring would probably take you weeks, not months. I'd say Swift 6.2 is much closer to my idea of what Swift 6 should have been in the first place. Is it enough to convince everyone to migrate from Swift 5? I hope so, but I'm not entirely sure, especially when it comes to the majority of consumer apps. They rarely have high requirements for concurrent execution, and there's plenty of tools for fixing potential issues even in the older version of Swift. So, the concurrency updates are definitely a welcome addition to your developer toolchain. But I would argue they are far from being a true revolution. And you know what else isn't a true revolution, even though Apple wants you to think it is? You guessed it. What if we made buttons transparent so you can barely see their labels? As if they're made of glass. And what if we also made them shrink and stretch as you use them, as if they're not made of glass at all? This paradoxical idea seems to be at the center of the liquid glass redesign. And honestly, I still don't know what to think of it. Or do I? As a user, I find this liquid glass concept barely usable. And it looks like I'm not the only one who thinks this way. Because over the beta testing period, Apple repeatedly reduced the transparency of the glass layer. As it turns out, this wasn't enough. By version 26.1, Apple seems to have given up and added a tinted mode. This is supposed to fix some of the most hilarious examples of liquid glass. But besides this questionable redesign, there is one more change in how you as a user interact with the device, and you as a developer build apps for it. I'm talking about the full window and support on the iPad. Now, it's true, most iPads have too small of a screen to take advantage of more than 2 windows. But this is definitely a huge addition for power users. The change didn't go well in every aspect. For example, Apple removed the familiar split screen and slide over modes, only to add them back in iOS 26.2. Maybe the next change would be the removal of that Stage Manager mode. Do you know anyone who actually uses it? I don't. To encourage multi-window support, Apple deprecated the legacy UI application delegate. Starting next year, you'll be required to use UI scene delegate instead. And in my opinion, this is one of the best examples of API management and housekeeping. UI scene delegate was introduced back in 2019, so you've been given over 6 years to migrate. What's even better, migrating to UI scene delegate doesn't force you to support multiple windows if you don't need them. To me, this only proves that Apple is still fully capable of delivering solid SDK updates. In that light, the chaotic evolution of Swift UI looks more like a choice and not something inevitable. And speaking of SDKs, let's have a look at something brand new. The thing that I find one of the most exciting this year arrived only a few weeks ago. It is the official Swift SDK for Android. The Android workgroup was announced a few months earlier after the WWDC. And to be honest, I didn't expect to see a concrete product of its efforts so soon. The Swift SDK is still a preview, and it requires installing a separate snapshot of the Swift toolchain. That is to say, Xcode alone is not enough to try out the SDK. The Swift website offers a step-by-step guide for building and running a Hello World project. It requires a special version of Swift, the Swift SDK itself, plus the usual tools for Android development. And while developing and debugging such cross-platform apps isn't very convenient yet, this is still a giant step forward. The potential impact of Swift on Android is pretty clear. But what about the time frame? I would argue that Swift on Android is not the same as Swift on Java backend. When it comes to mobile app development, expectations of years-long stability and decades-old legacy are much more difficult to find. Many products have a 1 or 2 week release cycle, and they can frequently experiment with new tech. All that makes the Swift SDK for Android a fairly low-cost thing to try and remove quickly if it doesn't work out. So, if you're interested in building something real with it, you can probably do so in only a week or 2. And that would even include automated testing and continuous integration. In other words, you can have a feature suitable for production use pretty quickly. With the barrier to enter so low, I'd be surprised if many companies don't start getting their feet wet in the coming months. Here comes the final change I want to highlight, and it is a development of a different kind. I'm talking about this year's developments in the antitrust cases against Apple, here and abroad. Apple should have seen it coming, but until the last second it tried to find a loophole and escape the inevitable. And now that the actual problems have started to materialize, I'm not totally sure Apple is prepared for them. Here's just a few things. Back in April, Apple got a €500 million fine for violating the DMA. That same month, Apple lost the ability to charge the bizarre 27% fee on external payments in the US. Essentially, developers can keep all their revenue, at least for now. Apple was prohibited from displaying those giant and misleading scare screens. Those that say that only the App Store can protect your data. Yeah, sure. I have personally witnessed and documented how exactly the App Store protects user data. Oh, and by the way, Apple has credited me with a valid vulnerability report for discovering it. Except the actual systems continue to employ the mechanism that enabled the leak in the first place. That's what you call data protection, I guess. But if that's not enough, there's more. Apple lost a class action lawsuit in the UK. It got another investigation in Europe, this time into the so-called core technology fee. In Apple's opinion, making a device entitles it to not only charge customers for the hardware, but also extract money from every app developer, even if their apps are entirely free to use. That doesn't sound too convincing to me, and the European Commission wasn't impressed either. On top of that, Apple can no longer dictate developers what their payment links and buttons should look like. Japan has enforced similar rules for alternative app stores. And Apple introduced a similar fee, only it's called the Core Technology Commission. Fee? Commission? Nothing similar. We can also consider older cases and future changes, like when Apple tried to break PWAs in retaliation against Europe's DMA. In any case, I would say that the overall picture is quite clear. Apple is not evil just by itself. Apple is a giant corporation, which means it will do evil things, unless it's kept in check. I've been publishing my indie apps on the App Store for nearly 8 years. In that time, I've had my fair share of random rejections. And that is why I'm glad the situation finally seems to start changing. As an example, Apple has recently announced the Mini Apps Partner Program. In a sudden change of heart, now Apple not only allows super apps, but also charges only 15% in fees instead of 30%. You as a developer get more flexibility and better terms. And all that is a direct result of the regulatory pressure. So, these have been my picks for this year's key updates that impact your life as a developer. Now I wonder what you think. Tell me in the comments about your discoveries from this year. Subscribe to the Codebird for more engineering content, and stay tuned for the next video. Until then, make your glass solid.